This instructional video is designed to further assist schools, further education and training centres, and all other settings in the process of arriving at an estimated percentage mark and ranking for each student in this year's Leaving Certificate class. This supplementary guidance provides additional information to schools on areas including guidance on the avoidance of unconscious bias and interpreting evidence of achievement in the case of students with disabilities. It is very important that schools and teachers remain alert to possible sources of unconscious bias that might affect the calculated grade process, and to exercise objectivity in generating estimated percentage marks and rank orders so that schools and teachers can ensure that the estimates that are made are as fair as possible. By being alert to sources of unconscious bias, there is a better chance of examining the evidence more objectively, focusing on evidence that is clearly about attainment in the subject and not about other factors. Similarly, research also suggests that teacher estimates can be unconsciously affected by what they know or think they know about a student's background, such as their socioeconomic or family background. Knowing that this can happen gives a teacher a better chance of focusing on evidence and considering why it is thought a particular student will achieve a particular standard. In order to remain objective, it is very important that the school's judgments should only take account of existing records of achievement and available evidence of a student's knowledge, skills, and abilities in relation to the subject concerned. This evidence should inform teachers' professional judgments about each student's likely performance in the examination. Other factors should not affect this judgment, including, but not limited to, characteristics protected under equality legislation, such as gender, marital status, family status, sexual orientation, religion, age, disability, race, and membership of the traveller community. Similarly, judgments should not be allowed to be influenced by a student's behaviour, whether good or challenging, their character, appearance, social class, or absences from school-based summative assessments due to illness, for example. To avoid unconscious bias, schools and teachers are encouraged to reflect on and question whether they may have any preconceptions about each student's performance and whether their perception of the evidence might be affected by any irrelevant factors. Confirmation bias is a tendency to search for and interpret information that aligns with one's preconceived opinions about a student. For example, if one makes a judgment about a student, one may subconsciously search for evidence to support that judgment, noticing only evidence about a student that fits with pre-existing views about them, thereby unduly affecting the student's grade. Halo or masking effects is a tendency to perceive one very positive thing about a student and allow that halo glow of that one thing colour our opinions, which may hide or overly accentuate the student's actual knowledge, skills, and abilities. The Horns effect is the direct opposite of the halo or masking effect and occurs when perception of someone is unduly influenced by one negative trait, for example, challenging behaviour. Primacy effects. The primacy bias error occurs when assessment is made based on information that was presented earlier, for example, giving undue weight to first impressions of a student. Recency effect is a bias which is the opposite to the primacy bias and occurs when an assessment is overly affected by information that was presented later, that is, more recently, rather than earlier in any given selection process. For example, giving undue weight to the most recent interaction with a student or the most recent piece of work done by that student. Selective bias. This is a perceptions bias, whereby undue weight may be given to a student's performance on a particular part of the content of the specification, rather than considering performance across all of the material. Contrast effects is the tendency to mentally upgrade or downgrade a student's likely performance when comparing it to a contrasting group of students. For example, over or underestimating a student's likely performance, having first considered a large number of students who are all working at a different standard. Active consideration of the avoidance of unconscious bias, particularly that related to any of the 9 grounds referred to in the Equal Status Acts, should apply during all stages of school-based phase of the calculated grades process. The preliminary work of individual teachers, the work of the subject alignment group, and oversight by the school principal. The material in relation to the avoidance of unconscious bias also applies in the case of students with disabilities. Additionally, the Guide for Schools deals specifically with the question of reasonable accommodations in the examinations. It states in section 13 that where any reasonable accommodation has been approved for any student, such as a reader, scribe, or waiver, the estimate of the student's likely performance should be based on the assumption that this accommodation would have been available had the examinations been conducted in the normal way. Since accommodations are intended to reflect students' normal way of working in class, this should not require any special intervention beyond the teacher's existing understanding of how the student gets on with the relevant supports in place. As noted in the Guide for Schools, the scheme of reasonable accommodations operates on the premise that, in the vast majority of cases, any disability that affects a student's capacity to demonstrate their achievements in the examination has been identified earlier on the student's progress through school. Accordingly, it is assumed that the necessary supports for learning have been put in place and that appropriate supports and accommodations have also been in place for the formal and informal assessment activities that take place throughout the 2 years of whichever Leaving Certificate program the students are following. These arrangements will not necessarily have been identical to those provided during the certificate examinations, as the context and constraints are different, but they will have been intended to achieve the same objective. That is, to remove any access barriers that might stand in the way of a student fully understanding what they are being asked to do and/or demonstrate what they know and can do. With regard to any student with additional needs that necessitate support and/or accommodation in a learning or assessment environment, it is expected that all of the student's teachers will have been made aware of the nature of the need and the appropriate supports at the time they were first identified. In circumstances where school management is not confident that this has occurred, they should ensure that all necessary information on students with disabilities is provided to all teachers to inform their work in estimating percentage marks. In interpreting any evidence from such tests or assessments when forming a judgment as to the likely performance of such a student, consideration should be given as to whether the arrangements in place at the time of that assessment were adequate for that purpose. If they were not, then the teacher will need to take account of this and, based on their knowledge of how the student does in class when normal supports are in place, consider how the student is likely to have achieved on the assessment concerned in the event that appropriate arrangements had been in place. Likewise, as already highlighted, it is very important to remain alert to possible sources of unconscious bias that might affect estimates. It is assumed that all teachers are aware of their students' individual learning needs and have provided the necessary classroom-based supports to remove any barriers that may have had an impact on their performance in formative and summative assessments. It is also assumed that teachers have a very good knowledge of their students. However, being alert to the source or sources of any unconscious bias, there is a better chance of examining the evidence more objectively, focusing on evidence that is clearly about attainment in the subject and not about other factors such as behaviour or learning disability, for example. Teachers' knowledge and observations of individual students' learning, formative assessment of that learning during classroom interactions, and summative assessment of attainment may combine to inform a teacher's evidence base for estimated percentage marks for students with disability, as indeed it does for all other students. Additional care should be taken in any cases where there has been a late diagnosis of disability, in that it may have occurred sometime during the 2 years of the programme concerned. In this case, account should be taken of the fact that outcomes from tests and other assessments that predate supports being put in place may underrepresent the student's actual level of achievement in the subject, module, or task under consideration. It should be noted that a close familiarity with the details of the scheme of reasonable accommodations operated by the State Examinations Commission, including the details of how various accommodations and waivers are implemented, is not required in order to make the professional judgments that are required. It is the underlying principles of the scheme that are most important. Key among these are that the arrangements are not intended to compensate for any lack of achievement resulting from a disability, but to remove, as far as possible, any barriers to the students displaying their true underlying levels of achievement. Some examination accommodations involve a waiver or an exemption, which means that there is an element or elements of the discipline that these students will not be tested on. Where a student has been granted a waiver or an exemption, then any deficiency that the student might previously have displayed in respect of the element waived should be ignored when arriving at an estimated mark. The focus should be solely on the aspects of the discipline that have not been waived. For example, if a student for Leaving Certificate English has been granted a waiver of spelling and written punctuation, then the teacher should consider the extent to which he or she might have penalised that student in the past for such errors in their classwork, tests, and assessments. The teacher should then, when interpreting and weighing evidence of achievement, take account of the fact that deficiencies in spelling and punctuation would have been removed from consideration if the examinations had happened as normal. The supplement to the Guide for Schools document is available on gov.ie/leaving certificate, and this provides further detail. I want to thank you very much for your attention.